When a crisis strikes a country in the way that the coronavirus is currently striking India, one measure of that crisis's impact is the reaction of that country's stock market, as well as any fluctuations in GDP. Many of you probably remember the global financial crisis of 2008. It took a huge toll on the world's economy and is considered to be one of the most serious financial crises in contemporary history. Its epicenter was the United States' banking sector, but it soon engulfed the entire world and is now known as the Great Recession. So given that this is Backstage with Millionaires and we talk about Indian stuff like Indian startups and Indian entrepreneurs, today we're going to be talking about India's economy and specifically how the coronavirus is going to be affecting it. But before we do that, let's take a look at how the Great Recession back in 2008 affected this country so that we have a little bit of context. Up until 2008, India's economy had been growing at 7.5% every single year, which was pretty fast. Sensex had just touched 20,000 in January of that year and had been growing at 3x every single year for the last 3 years. However, after the seismic waves of America's banking collapse began to circle the globe, that growth came to a dramatic halt. By the end of 2008, that 3x growth had become 3% growth, and Sensex had gone from 20,000 to 9,000. All right, so that was 2008. And while there are many similarities between the Great Recession and the current economic crisis that we're going through today, there's one key difference. The 2008 recession was a financial crisis in and of itself, whereas this recession is a byproduct of something even worse: the coronavirus. And that's really scary to think about because that was the Great Recession. It was a big deal. But according to the IMF's managing director, Kristalina Georgieva, this recession is way worse than the global financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. This sentiment was echoed by the IMF's chief economist, Geeta Gopinath, who said, "It is very likely that this year, the global economy will experience its worst recession since the Great Depression." And I don't know about you, but that kind of makes me wonder what we're going to be calling this recession when it's all said and done. Since the beginning of the year when the coronavirus started to spread from China to other parts of the world, Sensex has fallen by about 10,000 points, from 41,000 to 31,000, give or take. So that's roughly a 25% decrease in market value. That means that investors have already lost 34 lakh crores, that's 34 trillion rupees, in the last 3 months. To put that into perspective, India's GDP is about 190 lakh crores, that's 190 trillion rupees. So the amount that's already been lost is roughly 17% of India's entire GDP. And things aren't getting better either. They're getting worse. Before all of this began, Moody's predicted that India's GDP would increase by 5.3%. However, thanks to the coronavirus, that number has since been revised to 2.5%. So we're essentially cutting that number in half. Fitch, on the other hand, predicted a growth of 5.6% back in December, but then at the beginning of April, they revised that number to 2%. And do keep in mind that these estimates were made before the 21-day lockdown became a 5.5-week lockdown. So these estimates may be reduced even further once the situation has been fully assessed. Now, obviously a decrease in GDP is bad for everybody. The entire country is going to be affected by this. However, certain sectors are definitely going to be hit harder than others. So let's take a look at that and see which sectors are going to be hit the hardest and why. Firstly, let's talk about tourism. It doesn't matter where you are in the world right now, if you're in the tourism industry, you're having a bad time. Now, specifically talking about India, roughly 10% of the country's GDP comes from tourism, and it's just not happening right now. The country is under lockdown. Tourists can't even visit India if they want to. But even if they could, even if India wasn't under lockdown and there were flights coming to and from the country, would people really be wanting to travel to India for tourism? I guess it really depends on how hard this recession hits the rest of the world. The UN Labor Organization is predicting that 25 million people are going to be laid off thanks to the coronavirus. And I'm guessing that just as many or more are going to be seeing salary cuts too, as the companies that they work for struggle to survive. And so I'm predicting that in the aftermath of the coronavirus, once the dust has settled, there's not going to be a lot of people who are thinking about or prioritizing tourism and travel. A lot of people are just going to be trying to pick up the pieces of their shattered careers. People get to, leave from, and travel within India via plane. And so that's another industry that is and will be hit really hard here. If the travel ban extends up until the end of June, it's expected that the coronavirus in the first quarter of the financial year 2021 is going to cost India's aviation industry $3.6 billion. And do keep in mind that most Indian airlines are already operating under heavy losses. So we can probably expect to see about 500,000 jobs disappearing in this industry thanks to the coronavirus. And we're actually already seeing airlines like Go Air, Vistara, Indigo, and SpiceJet cutting the salaries of their employees or asking their employees to go on unpaid leave. And if the situation gets worse, and it's looking like it probably will get worse, then salary cuts might not be enough. And then of course we've got the hotel industry. HVS, a hospitality-focused American consulting firm, is predicting that if demand picks back up in this space by July, then the branded, organized segment of this market here in India will only suffer a loss of $3.35 billion. However, if demand doesn't start to pick up by October or November, which may very well happen if we see a second wave of the coronavirus or more lockdowns or both, then the loss is going to be closer to $4.1 billion. Now, $3.35 to $4.1 billion is a lot of money, but you've got to remember that only about 5% of hotels in India are part of this organized sector. The rest of the country's hotels are semi-organized or unorganized, and they make up the remaining 95% of the market. HVS is predicting a loss of $5.3 billion in this segment if normalcy starts to return to India's hotel industry in July, and $5.95 billion if COVID-19 is still wreaking havoc here in India in October or November. So adding all that up real quick, best case scenario, at least according to this report, is an $8.65 billion loss, and the worst case scenario is more than $10 billion. These losses would be an erosion of somewhere between 39 and 45% compared to last year. And the reason that this is all happening is the same as the aviation industry. People aren't traveling. They're not going to new places where they need to stay in a hotel. They're staying at home, right? They're in lockdown. But even if they were traveling, they probably wouldn't want to stay in a hotel room because you never know who was in the room before you, right? You never know if the person who used that room before you did had the coronavirus. Even if the hotel assures you that guaranteed 100% the room has been fully sanitized, every thread of the blanket on the bed has been scrubbed and every tile in the bathroom has been cleaned, there's still going to be that doubt in the back of your mind. Now, according to the Federation of Associations in Indian Tourism and Hospitality, around 3.8 crore people, that's 38 million people, out of an estimated workforce of 5.5 crore people, might be losing their jobs because of this. That's about 70% of the jobs in this sector. And just so that you have something to compare these numbers to, the population of Delhi is about 3 crores. So just imagine that over the course of a couple of months, the entire population of Delhi became unemployed, plus another 80 lakhs somewhere else like Noida or Gurgaon. That's what we're looking at here in the hospitality space. All right, moving on to the next industry, and actually the last industry that I wanted to talk about in this video, e-commerce. Over the course of the last couple of years, the popularity and success of e-commerce here in India has exploded. But according to a Forrester report, during the first week of the lockdown, the e-commerce sector saw a $400 million loss in sales. The report also predicted that these losses would total $1 billion before the lockdown is over, which is really unfortunate because Forrester had previously predicted that India's e-commerce sector would see a 26% growth this year. However, they've revised that estimate now to 5%. Now, you might be thinking to yourself that aren't people buying more online now than ever before? And if you're talking about essentials and groceries, stuff like that, then the answer is yes. However, these things make up just 6% of the overall GMV, that's gross merchandise value, for these e-commerce companies in India. The real money in e-commerce comes from apparel and electronics. If you take those two and combine them, they make up more than 3/4 of all of the sales on e-commerce websites. And just like travel and tourism, there aren't a lot of people right now who are spending their money on apparel and electronics. A lot of the country is just trying to survive. So yeah, things are really bad right now. But just remember that because you're watching this video right now, I know that you already have two things that a lot of people in this country don't have. One of them is the ability to speak English, which makes me think that you probably have received some level of education. I mean, a lot of people don't speak English, right? And that's because perhaps they didn't go to school and they didn't learn that language. And the other thing is that you have a device. You have a laptop, you have a tablet, you have a smartphone, you have something that you're watching this video on. And there's a lot of people who don't have that, right? There's people out in villages like tier 3 cities or even, smaller areas where there's people living and some of them don't even have electricity. Now, at first glance, it might actually seem advantageous that some of these people are isolated, right? Maybe they're in some rural village and they're not coming in contact with people the way that people like me living in the city do. But at the same time, if the economy in the country is collapsing, that's going to affect them, right? One way or another. When the economy collapses, everybody loses money, even these people, actually, especially these people. And by the way, these people, they make up about 60% of the population here in India, but they only have about 4.7% of the wealth. But thankfully, India is responding to this. The government is aware that these people exist, and they've set up a relief fund for these people. 1.7 trillion rupees is being allocated to this relief fund, and it's expected to go into the hands of about 800 million people. With these funds, people are going to be buying food, cooking gas, and they're also just going to be taking home some cash that they can perhaps put away. They can pay, their bills, or they can put it away and save that money for a rainy day, and I'm sure there's a lot of rainy days to come, so that'll be really useful for them as well. And then on top of that, there's also a bunch of businesses, startups, and individual people who are pledging money to the least fortunate people in Indian society so that they can survive this recession. But coming back to the business side of things, if you've been watching this channel for a little while, or you yourself are an entrepreneur, then you know that cash flow is king. And cash flow can actually kill you as well as a company. And that's actually the biggest threat right now to a lot of the businesses and startups across the country. In response to this, the RBI has infused a 3.74 lakh crore stimulus into the financial system. And this is being lent out to companies that need it so that they can survive. And then recently, as the lockdown was extended further, the RBI announced another 1 lakh crore relief package to help MBFCs and SMEs secure funds for operations. Now, if you compare this response to what's being said by the IMF, and remember what they're saying is that this recession is definitely going to be worse than the Great Recession back in 2008 and might even be comparable to the Great Depression, then this kind of looks like you're putting a band-aid on a laceration, right? Indian businesses and the Indian economy as a whole is going to need a lot more than just these 2 infusions. There are and will continue to be massive layoffs. People are losing money. They're suffering everywhere that you look, but the extent of that suffering will be decided in large part by the decisions that the government has made and will continue to make in the future. But even if the Indian government doesn't make the right decisions here, and let's face it, this is uncharted territory, right? Every country is responding to this differently. India will survive, right? India will recover. At least that's what the Great Recession leads me to believe. Remember I said that Sensex back in January of 2008 was at 20,000, then it went down to 9,000 as a result of the Great Recession. But since then, it's gone up more than double what it was before the Great Recession to 40,000. Now, we've gone from 41,000 to 31,000, so obviously some of the ground has been lost, unfortunately. But what I'm trying to say here is that people, they learn. They learn from crises. And then when the crisis is over, they take those learnings and they act on them. The Great Recession was painful, but our understanding of the global economy was enhanced by it. And this understanding has resulted in more robust business frameworks that have fueled future growth, not only in India, but in the entire world. And that's what I'm predicting is going to happen here too, right? Once the crisis is over, coronavirus is in the past, hopefully, we get to that day, then businesses are going to be focusing on implementing the learnings that they've acquired during this crisis, right? They're going to be focusing on profitability and conserving cash and sustainability. And so the next few months and, probably the next couple of years actually are going to be hard, right? For some people, they're going to be awful. But we will get through this. Things will get better, and this recession, just like every other recession that's ever happened in the history of the planet, will be over, guys. So yeah, just keep that in mind when you're feeling low, when times are getting tough during this lockdown, and even if you're watching this after the lockdown, this will be over someday, and we will recover from it, globally and specifically here in India. So stay safe, stay home, and I'll see you guys in the next one.